attending school and to have a good reputation. Because I think that's what every parent wants.
Sure.
So we wrote indicators under that, that we felt were appropriate for our community. And I took it to Africa and went back to the 3 or 4 villages that were working and said, I'd like to change the program. I want to start with this, and then I see a different way that we could use the other piece. So we started the program called Outcomes for Children, and it gave us a big boost. We really saw, that's when we saw the death rate for children really drop quickly and radically. And community, in a sense, I guess a non-currency based economic standard would be substantially better. If people are healthier across the measurements that we used, things are starting to work. It's still just not clicking for me. And I'd come home again and I read about this program called Open Space, and it's actually a corporate meeting system. It was designed by a friend of mine, actually, Owen Harrison. I didn't know him then. I became friends because I read about his program and kind of hunted him down. So I think this will work in Africa. He goes, I started it in Africa. That's great. And we added that piece, and I changed the program. So let me give you the end of the story here. Today we have a program that takes 3 days. That's all we spend in the community. I don't allow white people or foreigners to train or facilitate in a community. Community is facilitated by someone from that community, by one of our African leaders who will train them. In Village Care, each of the 11 countries we're in has their own NGO with their own board of directors. There are no foreigners on the boards of directors. They're all indigenous to their own countries. The program works this way. We come into a community, and the facilitator will write the word safe down on a blank sheet of paper. We have something called sticky wall. In sticky wall, we just stick a canvas sheet up on a wall somewhere between a couple of trees, and it's sprayed with Scotch tacky adhesive. Take the word and he'll stick it up on the wall. And then he just says, in your community, and whoever comes is welcome to come. Our rule is whoever comes are the right people. We want to invite everybody in the community, and usually it's the poorest who come, and that's turned out to be a godsend. So, in fact, the higher the group in terms of leadership in a community, the less likely it is to work. So we learn to be diplomatic with community leaders and local leaders. We give them a lot of credit, but the less they're involved in the program, the more likely it is to work. And they'll stick the word up there and they'll say, okay, in your language, here in your community, what does it mean for a child to be safe? And then he shuts up. And they'll debate, and usually mostly women will show up. Men later will take all the credit for this.
Of course they do.
And we kind of let them now. We've learned a lot over the last few years to just ignore people and egos, and just do the work. In our programs, there are 5 women involved for every man, and women are 5 times more likely to succeed with the Green program, for example, 5 times easily more likely to succeed. And yet, I have to say, we have removed all funding, all idea generating. We do not put money into a community. It's not at that point, and there's a huge reason for this. But anyway, so they'll debate among themselves until they come up with the word that intuitively they recognize as, if a kid's safe, that's the word we're looking for, And that's what my friend did here in Placer County. They had to come up with their own word. And then the next one, for example, in that category, there's 5 indicators. What does it mean for a kid to be safe? What would you look at? And one of the indicators is cared for and protected. And other indicators are more physical and measurable. So we've sort of mixed it up, a little bit of the metaphysical with a little bit of the facts and science of what it means to be safe. And then so they'll finish their little column, and then they'll move on to the next one. What does it mean for a child to be healthy? And they'll have to define it among themselves in the context of their community.
So you don't get involved with cultural things like
we
genital mutilation,
well,
or that
well, I
doesn't
did
even
for
come
years. FGM was a huge issue in these areas. 90% of the area that I work in, probably all of the areas we work in, are polygamous. FGM is traditional. FGM is still practiced in those communities today.
Yeah.
And I worked on the, preaching the change the tradition for years and had zero impact. And we stopped using the word tradition. We don't use the word change. We just say, here's the 5 things you should do. And they write it down, and then they do, by the end of the day, the first day, they've written their own Outcomes for Children program in their own language. So they own it. And those things then begin, and I learned it took a long time to figure this out, another part of the story. But the next day is the basic home practices. That's what we call them now. And the program's called OPUS now. It's Outcomes, Practices, and Open Space. And that's now the principle of all of our programs. Outcomes are the things you want to achieve. And in this case, we start with children. I wanted to target children. And we wanted measurable results. So we have a measurement system in place that measures the statistical percentage of children who are involved in those programs, enough to give us a truth. We have a simple rule. Something's true or it's not true. We won't do what missionaries did. Well, that didn't work, but you know what? All this other stuff happened. It was great. I don't do that. I think that's BS. What did we come here to do? Did it happen or did it not happen? And we've either succeeded or we failed. And those hard rules forced us into a pretty fast evolutionary process. But the community is now empowered for the first time. And the community of those who came. Whoever shows up with the right people, whatever you have when you get there is everything you need. I learned a lot of stuff in Africa about life because you really have to kind of let things go. And the next day is the tools. What are the tools we need to achieve these outcomes? Sanitation, nutrition, healthcare, education, economic security. And the real end, to your point on FGM, it started to drop. It's still huge. It's a big problem. But it started to drop when we dropped it, and they began to discuss it in those meetings.
I was going to ask you that. I was going to say, isn't that kind of the evolution of...
There's a huge reason for it, too,
Oh.
that it's really, and I missed it completely. It's a whole other interesting story, but because it's starting to work, everything's starting to work. Third day is Open Space Day. Open Space, we get everybody in a big circle, whoever came. And all the facilitator says is, so what do you want to talk about? Based on what you guys talked about the last 2 days, what do you want to do? And they get to break up in small groups. They can choose who they want to meet with. They have to pick a leader. They get into a group of 5 or 10 people. They have to pick a leader. And then they have to report back. They can meet for an hour. We blow a horn or a whistle, and they're out meeting wherever. Usually we'll spend the first couple hours of that day just organizing. We have 8 spaces or 10 spaces. There's area A, B, C, D. And we'll have that up on the sticky wall. And what do you want to talk about? And somebody will raise their hand. I want to talk about, digging pit latrines in our community. The one that stands out in my mind was in Nigeria. This guy stood up and said, "We need to get the pigs out of our homes." He said it just like that. I wouldn't have thought of that in a million years. And that's what's been fascinating to me, is to listen to the things they think of when you give them the critical structure to do it. And so generally within an hour they will have covered the grid of outcomes for children and basic home practices. If you took both those sets of 5 principles each as a grid, and we don't manage this, but it always emerges that they will have selected something that crosses those 2 points across the board. It happens almost every time.
Do you mind, how many people usually come and show up?
I've had as few as 10 and as many as 2,000. I mean, it's just not predictable at all. We had one in Tanzania 3 years ago, and Tanzania is one of our best countries now, where probably 2,500 showed up, 30 villages. And we just, because they heard it had happened in a couple other areas. And those are different and harder, because that's a huge amount of people to manage. So we'll usually do a little less facilitation, a little more information, and then break them up into their communities and go back and train the communities. In that one, we didn't have to. We went back and trained 3 communities and couldn't really get in there again for a while, and went back a year later and they had trained all the communities themselves. So that's worked out really well. and